So with your permission, seeing as it's days before Rosh Hashanah, I thought let's pause for a moment what we're learning in Pirkei Avos, and let's learn something about Rosh Hashanah, because you have to take advantage of this time, and you've got to learn and get into the headspace of Rosh Hashanah. But not just Rosh Hashanah generally, there's something very unique about this year's Rosh Hashanah that we have to unpack, and that's the fact that it's Shabbos. So what happens when first day of Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos? What's the big thing that happens? You don't blow the shofar, right? So we don't blow the shofar. The question is, why not? Why don't we blow the shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah? Exactly. Sounds like a bit of a, come on. Sounds like a little bit of a strange reason. So that's what we're going to unpack over here today. So the Gemara tells us that this is what is called Gezerah de Rabbah. There was a great sage called Rabbah, and at his time he was the greatest of all the sages at the time. And Rabbah made this Gezerah, he made this decree that if, it's not only Rosh Hashanah, the same thing applies to Sukkot, that if the first day of Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos, and then naturally the first day of Sukkot will be on a Shabbos, so the mitzvahs that are unique to those days, we cancel for the day. And the reason is, what happens, and this is specifically the case with Rosh Hashanah, what happens if a person doesn't know how to blow the shofar, but they own a shofar? So maybe they're going to take their shofar that they own, and they're going to carry it to somebody else's house, because the other person knows how to blow the shofar, and they're going to carry it, Daled Amos Birashus Harabim, they're going to carry the shofar 4 Amos in a public space. For that reason, we don't blow shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah if it coincides with Shabbos. What's the exception? There's one exception. What's the exception? The exception is that it says, and this is actually a Mishnah, it says, Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah Shchol b'Shabbos, if Rosh Hashanah coincides with Shabbos, B'mikdash hayu toikin, they would blow the shofar inside the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? So in the Beis HaMikdash they blow the shofar, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, everywhere else in the rest of the world until today, we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah Shechol Liyos b'Shabbos where it coincides with Shabbos. Why? Because there might be some nudnik somewhere who doesn't know what they're doing and doesn't know that they're not supposed to carry the shofar on Shabbos into the street. So therefore we're worried that they're going to break Shabbos and their whole community doesn't get to blow the shofar because of this. So let's understand this. Who said that we have to blow the shofar? Hashem. It's deoraisa. It is mandated by the Torah that you have to blow the shofar. Yes? It's a mitzvahs asay deoraisa, a positive mitzvah directly out of the Torah. Who do the rabbis think they are? They're going to come to engage with a mitzvah that the Torah mandates and tell us you can't do this mitzvah. Who gave them that authority? That's question 1. Question 2. On what basis? What? Because there might be somebody, because that's what it says. Shema. Maybe there's going to be somebody who doesn't keep the halachos, who doesn't know what they're doing, and they're going to break Shabbos. So because of that, let's say that there is this one individual, and it's not likely that this one individual will happen every single time that Rosh Hashanah is on a Shabbos. We're going to jeopardize the entire community and not allow them the opportunity to do a mitzvah because of one person. I got news for you. This could possibly apply to other mitzvahs too. I'm pretty sure that we're a creative group of people, and if we put our heads to it, we could probably come up with a whole lot of other scenarios where you should be careful about doing a particular mitzvah in case somebody else gets it wrong, and then they're going to wreck it for the rest of us. For example, maybe you shouldn't eat matzah on the first night of Pesach if it's on Shabbos, in case somebody doesn't know how to do a seder, so they pack up their matzah and their wine in a bag and they go to somebody else's house and they carry in the public domain in order to find out how to keep Pesach. Same problem, no? It's not the same problem. Yeah? So why is it that when it comes to shofar, and I think everybody will acknowledge that Rosh Hashanah is a pretty important day, and it really gets everybody involved. So Rosh Hashanah, which is such a holy day, we're willing to put it on ice for this one person who might get it all wrong. But other mitzvahs, and I'm pretty sure there are others we could think of, we don't jeopardize the community for the sake of the one person who might go, off the reservation. Let's take it a step further. Reshus Harabim. Our concern is that the person's going to carry their shofar in a Reshus Harabim, which is a public domain. Where's the closest Reshus Harabim to where you live? Because remember, a Reshus Harabim is 16 amos wide, that's 8 meters wide, and it has a pedestrian traffic rate of 600,000 people a day. So where's the next closest Reshus Harabim to where you live? Meaning to say, let's put this into terms we can all relate to. If you live in a Jewish neighborhood, the chances are that if somebody was going to take their shofar and go to the next person in their neighborhood to have them blow the shofar, the chances are that they will not cross a Reshus Harabim. It's not going to happen. So at worst, what they might do wrong, they might break a rabbinic law. So now we're going to pause a Torah law for the possibility that somebody's going to break a rabbinic law. 1 second, let's take it a step further. Can you think of a Jewish neighborhood in the modern world that doesn't have an Eruv? In today's, okay, fine. In the time of the Gemara, maybe they didn't all have an Eruv, and so we get it, and so Rabbah made this particular decree. But maybe it's time to suspend the decree because we have an Eruv in most of our communities. So there's not even the concern that the person's going to take their shofar out. And I know that we have a principle which says that a latter day based in doesn't really have the authority to override something from an earlier based in. You have to have greater numbers and you have to have greater qualifications, and of course nobody's going to claim to have the greater qualifications and undo a gezerah. But it does seem a bit strange that we're willing to forego the shofar on Rosh Hashanah for this. I'm sure you've seen this with other people as well, but I have to coach people who are not that observant and are used to only coming to shul on the first day of Rosh Hashanah to tell them that this year you've got to actually come on the second day. Because otherwise you're going to miss the shofar, which is like the most important part of the whole of Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because of this guy who's going to carry his shofar outside. So now dozens, hundreds, I don't know, thousands of Jews may not hear the shofar at all because they're not going to get to shul on the second day. They'll come on the first day because that's what they're used to doing, right? So look at the cost of this particular institution. Why does this come to be that we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah because of such a minor concern? So to answer this question, we're going to have to do two things. The first thing is we'll have to clarify that it's obviously different. The whole nature of Rosh Hashanah when it's a Shabbos must be different to an ordinary Rosh Hashanah if we're willing to forego the shofar so easily. And in order to understand how that all works, why don't we ask ourselves a more basic question, which is, what does the shofar achieve? So we're not going to ask the question, why do we blow the shofar? Because that's obvious, because the Torah tells us we have to blow the shofar, so that's obvious. But we have to work out, what does the shofar achieve? Why is the shofar so important? Why is it the central part of the Rosh Hashanah experience on a regular basis? And only then can we address the question of how do we dispense with it when it's a Rosh Hashanah which falls on Shabbos, okay? So if I had to ask you what is the reason, or what is the achievement, what is the power, what is the energy of shofar, what would you say?
To get Hashem to move to Kisei Rachamim.
Okay, to get Hashem to move to the Kisei Rachamim. So in other words, we say that Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment, and Hashem is judging the entire world. And he has to, as we say, that's why the Chazan, by the way, I don't know if you've ever noticed, the Chazan who takes over the second part of Shachris starts with the word HaMelech, and they make a whole melodious dray before they start. Have you ever seen this? It's like a whole thing. Why? Because that's supposed to symbolize the movement that Hashem is shifting from the seat of judgment to the seat of mercy. And so apparently that's what the shofar is supposed to do. It's supposed to move Hashem from the seat of judgment to the seat of mercy. Okay, so if that's true, then we're in big trouble on Shabbos. Right? If Rosh Hashanah coincides with Shabbos, then we have to really behave all the way to the second day of Rosh Hashanah, because only then is he going to move, right? If that's what it's all about, right? Moving Hashem from the one seat to the other seat. What else? What else is the symbolism or the impact to wake us up, right? The pasuk says, "Hayitoka shofar ba'ir v'ha'am lo yecherodim." Is it possible that you'll blow a shofar in the city and people will not tremble? And by the way, that's why we blow the shofar in Elul. So we start waking up in advance, which maybe is a little bit like people setting their alarm and then pressing snooze for 30 days. But the point is that already before Rosh Hashanah comes along, we're supposed to be waking ourselves up, because the objective of the shofar, a big objective of the shofar, is to wake us up. Now let's analyze that for a second. What does it mean that the shofar is supposed to wake us up? I mean, it's true. When you hear the shofar, at some point, it does send a chill down your spine. It's one of those things. It's a very powerful, primal kind of sound, and it really gets us. Really, really gets us. The question is why? Why does the shofar get us so deeply? Is it because we've been trained this way? We've been kind of conditioned that, when the shofar blows, you should feel a particular way. Is that why it happens?
Because they also blew it on Mount Sinai.
So they blew the shofar on Mount Sinai. So let's be honest, how many people who come to shul on Rosh Hashanah are thinking about the fact that the shofar was blown on Mount Sinai? Some of us read it when we are. So it's in our soul, right? It's embedded inside of our DNA, and the shofar just speaks our language, right? It does. And that's why you hear these stories every year. Somebody will share a story at some point about the individual who had nothing to do with their Judaism, and then they heard the shofar, and somehow it spoke to them and it woke them up, because it does speak very much to our DNA, which is true. So what have we got so far? That it shifts Hashem into a position of compassion and mercy, and that it wakes us up. Is there anything else that the shofar is supposed to achieve?
It's the announcing, coronating.
Oh, there we go. Exactly. So a very big part of the shofar is it's supposed to be like the herald, the trumpet sound that you make at the time of a coronation of a king. And a big theme of Rosh Hashanah is HaMelech, that Hashem is our king. And by extension, Meloi Chaloilam Kuloi Bichvoidecha, that Hashem is the king, or should be acknowledged as such by the entire world. That's a very central theme of what Rosh Hashanah is all about, is to acknowledge Hashem as a king. So now let's ask ourselves this question. What are we actually doing over here? I mean, it sounds nice, let's be honest, to say that we're going to coronate Hashem as the king. But have we ever stopped to analyze this? What does it mean you coronate Hashem as the king? First of all, does Hashem need us?
Yes.
Hashem's waiting, right? He's waiting. When they're going to do it? When they're going to do it?
Can't be a king without such a king.
A king cannot, ein melech beloy am, that it's not possible to have a king without followers, without citizens, without a nation. The word specifically is am, a nation, which is a unique word that we use to represent a nation of people who are not necessarily so qualified. In fact, the word am is often used in a negative connotation, right? Look at the story of the golden calf, and Hashem says to Moshe, it says, what did this nation do to you? So it often implies an element of distance. So it's dafka not that we're so switched on and so holy and so connected and therefore we acknowledge Hashem as king. There's actually a certain element of the fact that we're distant and not exactly aligned, and that's what empowers us to make Hashem our king. But I go back to the same question. In the human experience, of course, ein melech beloy am, it's not possible to be a king without a nation. It's not only that, you know what we do with people who think they're a king and they don't have a nation. We have special places for them, right? Where we house such people who believe that they're Napoleon or whatever king it might be. So at the end of the day, in the human condition, obviously if a person has no following, they're not a king other than in their own imagination. But how does that apply to Hashem? Hashem is perfect. Hashem is infinite. Hashem doesn't need us. I mean, very often we do this. We use human parables to try to describe godly things. But we don't necessarily stop to ask, why is this a fitting parable? Just because things operate in a particular way in our experience doesn't automatically mean that that's how it is in Hashem's experience.
If we accept him as king, then we will follow what he says.
Correct. So if we accept Hashem as king, then we will follow what he says. And if we don't, God forbid.
Just obligating us.
Exactly. That affects us, right? It doesn't affect him. Doesn't affect him. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says Im chatasa it starts Im tzadakta matiten loy. If you've done righteous deeds, what have you given Hashem? V'rabu p'shoecha matase loy. And if you sin in abundance, how have you affected him? Right? So, this implication is that this is all for us, which is true. Obviously, for us to align ourselves with Hashem and to commit ourselves to Hashem is a very profound shift for us. But how does it make a difference to him? Hashem doesn't need us. I know it sounds very comforting for us to say that Hashem is waiting for us to coronate him as king, etc. But we need to understand how that's actually viable, because it doesn't really seem to make any sense. And the shofar is a really big part of this, because the shofar is supposed to be, like the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us, that Hashem says, obviously not in exactly these words, paraphrased by our sages, Imru lefonai malchios, on the day of Rosh Hashanah, read verses of where the Torah speaks about Hashem as a king, Kedei shetamlichuni aleichem, in order that you will coronate me or accept me as your king. And then the Gemara says, Uvameh b'shofar. And how do you actually do this? By blowing the shofar. So the shofar is clearly keyed into this principle of accepting Hashem as our king, which is true. But what we've got to work out is, why is that even relevant? Why, or how does it even work? Or why would Hashem, so to speak, depend on us blowing the shofar and as if it's going to make some major difference? And if we are actually supposed to accept Hashem as our king, which is definitely a major theme of Rosh Hashanah, why is the shofar specifically the way to do it? Other than the fact that in the human world, you blow that trumpet to herald the king, fine. But why is it relevant to Hashem? Like, if you think about it, surely of all of the things that we could contribute to Hashem, if theoretically we could contribute anything to Hashem, surely it would be deep understanding, meditation, or deep emotion that would actually be the language that would speak to Hashem. A shofar is, after all, just a piece of an animal's horn that is no longer even part of the animal. That means to say it's not even living anymore. So we've downgraded the shofar from being a living creature to now just being an instrument. And it just makes the most basic sound. There's no melody to it. It sounds like it's so unsophisticated. How could something like that really have an impact and speak the language that Hashem's going to respond to? It just seems very odd. The whole thing seems a little bit odd. So we've got to understand what's happening on Rosh Hashanah in order to understand what the shofar will contribute, in order to understand what this principle is of us accepting Hashem as king, in order to understand why, if Shabbos coincides with Rosh Hashanah, we're actually not blowing the shofar. So those are the pieces of the puzzle that we have to put together.
Would it be something to do with the fact that it's an animal, that it's this ram's horn, that is actually this primordial sound, but to actually show us that we are innovative?
Okay, so there's an interesting point. So you're saying that the horn comes from an animal, and we're more elevated than the animal. But the truth of the matter is, can you imagine? And we think of this as absolutely strange, but I guarantee you, if this would be our tradition, we would just accept it as normal, because we think it's completely normal to get up in front of a crowd of people in a religious setting and blow a ram's horn. Like, we just think that's normal because it's been passed down through the generations. So what would have happened if Hashem had told us that every Rosh Hashanah at a certain point in the davening, everybody has to scream from the depth of their gut? Because that's very primal. And we would have, like by now, generations down the line, we would have thought, well, that's actually normal. So why do we need the animal? Why do we need the horn of an animal to assist us?
Where does the Akeda come in?
The Akeda, fine, we'll talk about that. Maybe, if we have time.
And also to show us that we must lift ourselves out of our animal soul, and that in fact we could be like an animal, except we can talk and we can actually be higher. Okay, so if the objective, I hear what you're saying, and I agree that using an animal implement will obviously remind us of the animalistic traits that we have and challenge us to lift ourselves higher than an animal. But the question is, why don't we then bring like a living animal? Again, it would be normal. If this is what we did, it would be normal, right? Bring a ram into shul to represent the Akeda, because the Akeda wasn't a shofar, it was a ram. So let's bring a ram into shul, and if we really wanted to do it well, we could get a bush and tangle the ram's horns inside the bush. And that would be a very visceral expression of the fact that there's an animal and there's an Akeda and it's our animal soul and we should transcend ourselves. So there are various ways that this could happen. Why is this a particular way? Sorry.
So, because Avraham Avinu in that moment really showed what it meant to be Mamlech Hashem. You're showing that he loved Hashem and what Hashem's ratzon was more than what his own ratzon was with his son.
Right.
And the shofar's bent, and when you look at the horn, if you have the choice, I believe, between a straight or a bend, when you go with a bend,
correct, yeah.
You're showing that to really coronate Hashem as king, we have to bend ourselves.
Okay, that's a very important point. So there are two factors there. There's the story of Avraham Avinu, who was willing to basically sacrifice everything to do what Hashem wants. So that's the first point. And the second is how it's illustrated in the shofar, that it should be a bent shofar to imply that we bend ourselves, that we allow ourselves to be subservient to Hashem and not just stand our ground, okay, which is a very important point. So let's go back a step. What's the significance of today's date? Today is the 25th of Elul, which is the first day of creation, right? First day of creation. So it's a good day for us to talk about creation. How does creation happen? By speaking, yes? So Hashem spoke, and then things, right? Bidvar Hashem shamayim nasu. With the words, Hashem brought the world into existence. So that the methodology, the mechanics of creation is speech. We learned that, right, in Pirkei Avos at the beginning of the chapter we're currently doing, that Hashem created the world with 10 utterances. Speech. Okay? Speech. Now there's two questions that we have to ask ourselves about the nature of speech. If this is the particular metaphor that Hashem is using to describe creation, so we've got to think about how the metaphor works, and then based on that we have to ask ourselves a few questions. Question number one. Before you speak, what has to happen? You have to think. Unfortunately, most people don't, but you're meant to. That's how it's supposed to work, right? You're supposed to think first and then speak. What else is critical before a person will speak? Yeah, so you're saying physically, then you have vocal cords, right? But internally, what has to happen? And in fact, not only before you speak, but even before you think about speaking. Well, let's change the question a little bit. Let's change the question. Why would you speak? Why do you speak? When do you speak?
To actually daven, or you speak to talk about.
Okay, so the davening is higher grade. The average time that we speak is to communicate. Okay, so we need to be able to communicate. That means that we have to have something to communicate. That's why you're supposed to think before you speak, because you have to have content to communicate. But there's another very important point, and that is you have to want to. If you don't want to communicate, that's it. Nothing's going to happen. So we know that frustration. For example, I don't know if there's anybody here who's ever had the experience of when a teenager comes home from school. So you try and get some nuggets of what happened during the course of the day, right? So how was your day? Fine. What did the teacher have to say? Nothing. What did you do with your friends? Hung out. You know what I'm saying? So the person has to actually want, and then that same teenager, by the way, that same teenager that you get like 3.5 words out of the whole 8 hours of their day, will then go to the friend they've just spent the whole day with and speak on the phone for 2 hours straight. So what does that tell you? It's not for lack of what to communicate, it's for lack of wanting to communicate. So the key element of communication is ratzon. You have to want to communicate. Now comes the biggest question of all. What makes you want to communicate?
Connection.
Okay, connection, feeling. What's the feeling?
Sharing.
So you have feelings that you want to communicate. What makes you want to communicate your feelings? So connect. These are all good insights. Love, but let's summarize it. You have to. That's practical, right? You have somebody to communicate to, because if there's nobody to communicate to, you end up in the same place as the people who think they're kings, right? There's people who just talk and there's nobody that they're talking to. So it's the same principle, right? There's no king without a people. There's no speaking without an audience. But to create what? Okay, to create ideas, to create relationships, right? To create projects, because you're going to speak about your vision. So those things are all true. But we're missing the key factor of what makes us want to communicate. And the reason to be like Hashem, I'm sorry, but I don't think many of us communicate because we want to be like Hashem. It would be ideal if that was our motivation. But unfortunately, for most of us, that's not our motivation. Validation. So what does it feel like when you're validated? Good. Why do we communicate? Because we want to feel better. That's why we communicate. In other words, we communicate because if I'm able to share my ideas and somebody else commiserates, so I'm sharing my feelings, somebody commiserates my feelings, I feel better. Or if I've got something weighing on me, like the pasuk says, that if a person has a worry in their heart, they should speak it to other people. When you offload and you're able to share with somebody else, you feel better. If you've got something that you'd like to teach, and then you teach it, and people appreciate that you've taught them, you feel better. So in other words, the common denominator between all of these various reasons why people communicate is actually because once they've communicated, they will experience what we call tainug. Tainug is a very personal level of pleasure, as opposed to taiva, which is a very superficial type of pleasure. So for example, Shabbos, and I don't want to go down the whole Shabbos route yet, but Shabbos is called oineg. Shabbos is not a day to say, oh, the calories don't count, so I'm going to just fill all my taivas, all my superficial pleasures. Shabbos is a day of oineg. It's an invitation to have a very deep, intimate degree of pleasure. So if you had to really scale how people operate, Most of what we experience about people is the superficial once the person is speaking. That's what we experience, right? Once the person is speaking. If we are listening to what they're saying, we'll hear inside what they're saying the emotion. So we'll hear how they're speaking, or how much they care about what they're speaking about. And if we listen carefully, we'll understand the intellect, the concepts that they're sharing in the way that they speak. But if we listen even more deeply, we'll be able to hear what it is that this person needs in order to feel tainug, in order to feel that very deep sense of personal pleasure. And pleasure is a poor word in English, because pleasure is automatically associated with very, physical pleasures. So let's call it almost like a nachas. Nachas is something which is very personal, it's very intimate, it's very deep. It fills your soul. So the reason why a person wants to speak, wants to communicate, wants to share, and then of course, part of that process is not only sharing what you want to say, but also what you want to do. So let's say that a person has an idea, you tell people the idea, but your objective is not just to tell them the idea. The objective is to get the ball rolling, that the idea actually happens. When that idea comes to fruition, the amount of nachas, the amount of tainug that a person feels internally is incredible. So that's how Hashem designed human beings, that we work from a very deep core in different radial expressions. So we start off with, without even knowing it, with what's going to give me this tremendous sense of tainug, this tremendous sense of nachas. That's what creates ratzon. That's what motivates me to want to do things. And then I start thinking, feeling, speaking, doing. But really what sits at the core of everything is tainug. So let's put that into a slightly different example for a moment. So what is the greatest tainug that people have? And it's so funny, because when we ask this question, we're going to run around in circles before we settle on what is the most obvious answer, and yet it's so obvious we don't consider it. So what is the deepest tainug that people have? The most profound personal pleasure that people have? So, okay, that's already higher grade, right? To be able to bask in in divine presence, right? Is what? Making other people happy. What else? To be alive. That's what it is. The greatest tainug that a person has is the tainug of life itself. And that's why we get confused between the word taiva, which is pleasure or the seeking of pleasure, and tainug, which is something so intimate and so essential that you don't necessarily feel it. When do you know that your greatest tainug is to live? If, God forbid, anything threatens it. Because then the response, remember, tainug sits at the deepest part of who the person is, and therefore it impacts every other layer of who the person is. So chas v'shalom, God forbid something or someone challenges a person's life, they will find internal resources that they never even dreamt they had. In terms of ratzon, the will to live. So whether that's the person who fights through an illness, or whether it's the person who fights off a robber, it's the same principle. There's suddenly this ratzon, this motivation that they never knew that they had, and that ratzon motivates a whole different way of thinking about life, and a whole different set of emotions, and a whole course of action that the person would never have dreamt that they had within them. So that would be an example of real tainug. Life is the greatest tainug. Of course, meaningful life is even more so, because ultimately our neshama doesn't just want to live like an animal, it wants to live in a meaningful way and have a connection to Hashem. So why does Hashem create a world? He's modeled us after Him. But Selem Elokim Asas Adam, right? That's how we were created. Or as the pasuk says in Eov, Mi besari, from my own body, my own flesh, Echze Eloika, I'll be able to see how Hashem operates. So if Hashem has designed us in this way, that we have these multiple layers, but what sits at the core of us is a very profound tainug, the very profound pleasure of life itself, and maybe to a small extent, it's in each of us. Every one of us has a particular thing that we live for. That's our tainug. We live for. So if a person, for example, their greatest thing in the world, what gives them what fills their soul is helping people, so then that's going to motivate everything in their life. They'll always be coming up with ideas and projects to help people. If somebody is completely filled by their children, then they'll center their life on their children, and they'll invest completely in their children. So these are different examples of this concept of tainug. So why does Hashem create the world? Well, the Torah tells us how He creates the world. The Torah tells us, and this is today, Chof Hei Elul, the 25th of Elul, is the beginning of the story of how it happened. And Hashem said, let there be light. And Hashem said, let there be light. And then it all unfolded. And that's like any ordinary conversation that we have with somebody. They tell us something, we listen to what they have to say, and then we think that what they're saying is the beginning and end of the story. And that's exactly what happens to 99% of the population. They say, oh, whoa, look at this. Whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, it doesn't really make a difference in this context. People look at the world and they say, wow, how does that work? And then they ask the question, and how did it get here? And they go through this whole examination of the how, which is essentially like, like political analysts after a presidential debate. So they sit there and they say, well, how's this person going to do this? And how are they going to fulfill their campaign promises and whatever the case is. And they're people who dedicate their entire life, and it's very fulfilling, to trying to work out the how. How does it work? How many galaxies are there out there? How does the DNA of a human being work? Whatever it is. That's the world of science, and that's the world of philosophy. Okay, philosophy is a little different because the philosophy starts asking another question. But basically, Chof Hei Elul, today is the day that celebrates and commemorates how it all happened. It's a non-event on the Jewish calendar. Because how it happened isn't important. I mean, it's important, but it's not really important. What's most important is why. Now, up until the 6th day of creation, there was nobody who could ask why. Up until the 6th day of creation, every single thing that Hashem designed did not have the mental capacity to challenge what exists by asking a probing question. So whether it was the animals or the angels, they don't ask why. Comes Adam on the first day of creation, and he looks around and starts saying, there must be a being who put us here. What's the reason? Why are we here? So why is there this conversation? What motivated this conversation? In other words, the conversation Hashem has called creation. Because we already acknowledged right at the beginning that how does Hashem create the world? Through speech. So why is he having this conversation? And a little bit more nuanced, why is he having this conversation with us? That is a critical part of growth, and the purpose for which Hashem made the world was that we're empowered to be able to ask why. And why allows us to dig deeper than the words and even deeper than the wisdom behind the words, because we get so excited. We say, wow, do you know how amazing Hashem's creation is? Look how wise Hashem is. So we're looking in the words. The words produced these things. The words produced creatures and galaxies and natural flows and circumstances, whatever. And then we say, and look at the wisdom behind it, right? Not only am I listening to the words, but I'm also looking at the intellect behind the words. So we say, no, you've got to ask further than that. Why? Why did Hashem make a world? What was the purpose? What was the purpose of the world? Now, before we continue with answering or addressing that question to any extent, because it's not a question you can answer in one setting, but before we get to any of that, we also have to know that the different names that we use to refer to Hashem are actually names that are pegged to different layers of depth of how much godliness we're experiencing. Does that make sense? So, for example, if you go to a talk and the person gets up, so there's a motivational speaker, let's say, who comes to town, and the person gets up and they give a speech, and we walk out and then we feel very elevated and inspired. What do we say when we walk out? We say, wow, that person was a brilliant speaker. Because that's how much we've engaged with them. We don't know anything about their private life. We don't know anything about their personal struggles. We only know how brilliant they are as a speaker. So we'll call them a speaker. But when that person goes home, their children are not going to welcome them back and say, oh, speaker, you're home. Because it's a completely different relationship, right? And they appreciate something else that is more profound than just speaking. Now that's kind of what we do on Rosh Hashanah as well, because we mix our metaphors a little bit. Avinu Malkeinu. We speak about two different ways that we engage with Hashem. One is as a king and one is as a father. But the primary theme of Rosh Hashanah is Melech. Why is it the primary theme? Because the king is the element or the name that refers to Hashem speaking the world into creation. Why is that the name for Hashem speaking the world into creation? Because it says that the nature of a king is bidvar melech shilton. With the words, the king rules. You don't get to meet the king, speak to the king, analyze the king, engage with the king's deepest thoughts and feelings. As a citizen, all you do is you listen to what the king says and you follow. So that's why the king is the expression of Hashem running the world. The king is the expression of Hashem speaking the conversation called creation. So, how long can you speak in a single conversation? Depends, right? Depends who you're speaking to, and depends what you're speaking about. So there's certain topics that once you start, you may never stop. And there are other topics that you just want to get this over with as quickly as possible. What's the difference between them? How much tainug is invested in that particular conversation? Now, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but it happened to me the other day, and I was talking to somebody about a particular topic that's very close to my heart, and eventually at some point I thought, whoa, I don't know if they're still interested. So what happens when you're in that conversation and you don't know if the audience is still following or still engaged or still interested in what you have to say? What do? You pause. You pause. You pause, and then you see what kind of a reaction you're going to get. So if the reaction is going to be something like, we really must get together again, then you know you've definitely overstepped. But if the reaction is, why are you stopping? I want to hear the rest of your story. That's going to invigorate you, and not only will you continue speaking, but you'll actually probably share things you were not originally going to share, or you'll be more passionate about sharing because you can see that the person's really interested in what you have to say. Erev Rosh Hashanah, every single year, Hashem pauses the conversation. In the Zohar, it's called Durmita Dezah, which is a very complex way of saying it's almost like Hashem goes into sleep mode. Obviously not Hashem himself, but the dynamic of Hashem, that is creator. So again, it's like the speaker, the creator, aka the king, because Melech is the code name for Hashem as a speaker, as the one running the world. So he pauses on Erev Rosh Hashanah. As the sun goes down on Erev Rosh Hashanah, Hashem pauses the conversation. It's not that he's not going to continue the creative process. It's running in the background. The world still exists. And in order for the world to exist, Hashem is still feeding the world. But the question is, how much passion is he going to invest into the next conversation that's going to take the next 354 days on the Jewish calendar? Well, this year being a leap year, it will be longer. It's not a question of whether he's going to continue creating the world or not. That's obvious. The question is, how much of himself is he going to share in that conversation? Because exactly like the human metaphor that we are, if we have to continue, and it's all happened to us, right? You get up and you've got to give a speech. Let's say, I don't know. When I say give a speech, it doesn't have to be in a public forum that you're getting up as a lecturer. It could be that, sometimes you got to tell your children certain things that they have to know, right? So depending on the reaction that you're going to say the words, but how much enthusiasm, how much investment, how much life will you pump into those words is going to be directly relative to what kind of feedback you get from the audience. So that's what's happening on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Hashem says, okay, I'm going to pause for a moment and reassess how much are you in this conversation? Because I'm in this conversation, but how much are you in this conversation? And based on that, we'll determine what kind of invested energy Hashem is putting into the world for the next year. So from the moment Rosh Hashanah begins, we have to prove that we are very interested in this conversation. That means to say we have to prove that we are very interested in what Hashem wants in his world. We're not interested in the how. How's the year going to be? Are we going to have enough money? Will we all be healthy? I mean, those are all important things. But actually, they're secondary. The key we have to be asking is the why. How much am I aligned with the why Hashem created the world? Why did he create the world? Well, we're told right at the beginning, Bereshis, Bishvil Yisrael, Bishvil HaTorah. That's what we're told. The world was created for us and the fulfillment of Torah. So Rosh Hashanah should not be a day to say, tell me what else you can tell me. Tell me what else you can give me. Rosh Hashanah is supposed to be a day that says, let me show you how I'm actually fulfilling your why. I'm here to suit your why, your tainug, the real pleasure that you defined you would get in this world. Because we don't make a difference to you until you choose to make us your tainug, which you did. You said the Torah is for us. You said the world is for us. You said the world is for Torah. So you decided that the tainug, the deepest, most intimate core pleasure, that all of this is all about, is us doing what you want. So today, Rosh Hashanah, especially those first 12 or so hours of Rosh Hashanah from when it starts until we blow the shofar, that's our time to step up and say, we are the most engaged audience. We want to hear what it's really about. We don't just want to hear what is good for us, We want to hear what it's really all about. We want to hear what you expect of us. We want to show you our commitment. And all of that comes to a head when we pull out a shofar and we blow the shofar, because the significance of the shofar is that it's supposed to be, and this is why it's not musical, it's supposed to be a primal scream, not necessarily in panic, but more, it's almost like, I suppose, excuse the metaphor, but seeing as you wouldn't know these things, but it's over this Yom Tov, you're going to have men talking about the Rugby World Cup. So it's like the haka, lahavdil. It's this primal roar of commitment. It's my neshama speaking a language that doesn't have words. So let's just use an example we can relate to. Where do we have that in our lives? So let's say that somebody surprises a family member. There's somebody who lives overseas and they don't tell you that they're coming and they just rock up at your door. So you open the door. How do you respond? You scream, right? You definitely don't respond with like a whole speech because it's too primal. In fact, you may not even scream because you'll be speechless, right? You may not cry. You may not. You may be in such shock because this has touched you so deeply. In other words, it's not just shock when a family member arrives at the door unannounced. It's the deep tainug that we have, the tremendous pleasure and nachas that person brings into our lives that arrived in our faces without warning. So much is being churned up inside the depth of ourselves, we don't even have any way to express it. Not even a scream. That's what the shofar is. The shofar is called Kola Pnima'a de Lo Eshtama. It is the voice that is so deep that it actually can't be heard. You need an instrument to get the sound out. You can't even get the sound out of yourself. You need an instrument, like a really dead, unrelated, non-spiritual tool just to get the sound out. So the shofar is that moment where we say, Hashem, you have invested your tainug, your deepest so-called pleasure in us. We're responding with the deepest so-called pleasure of ourselves. In other words, this is our time. This is actually where we want to be. We don't even have the words for it. It's so profound, we can't enunciate it. That's why the shofar is so important. The shofar is going to be that moment that shakes us all to the core of our beings. That's why the shofar has such a profound effect on us. And that will in turn stimulate much more so-called enthusiasm from the Melech, the dimension of Hashem that runs our world, to make this to make this year that's coming much more infused with bracha and with goodness. Let's just finish the Shabbos thing and then we'll wrap it up. So what happens on Shabbos? You've taken away the core of what Rosh Hashanah is about. The whole point of Rosh Hashanah is we're supposed to be there, not trembling in our boots, but we're supposed to be there shaken to the core of our being at every range of emotion. So it's not only the emotions of fear, it's also this emotion of profound love. And we don't know how to put it all together. And that's why we're standing there and saying, we're yours. We're here. We're at your service. And then on Shabbos, we just go silent. How does that work? And the answer is, because the original Shabbos, the speech also went silent. That's what changed from Friday to Shabbos. Hashem was dynamically creating the world using the faculty of speech right throughout the 6 days of creation. The seventh day of creation, he's still creating the world, but in a silent way, using, so to speak, the faculty of thought. In other words, Hashem raises the whole of creation on Shabbos to a level that is more intimate than when he's speaking. So it's hard for us to have a parable for this because it's not really possible to have a conversation with somebody and then in the middle of the conversation you stop the conversation, you start telepathically communicating with them. But I think what's closest to that is people who have a very strong, long relationship. For example, couples who've been married for many years. So very often they don't actually have to speak to each other because they can just intuitively know what the other one is saying. So Shabbos is where Hashem invites us into a deeper level of connection with Him than on a regular day. I don't have to get to the point of speech to have this connection. The second thing about Shabbos is that we know v'karasa l'Shabbos oineg. Not only are you supposed to have oineg Shabbos, which is true. You are supposed to do things on Shabbos that are pleasurable. But it's beyond that. We say, V'karasa la Shabbos oineg. Shabbos is fundamentally, in the very DNA of its being, oineg. It is oineg, not tainug, like, you're going to have another scoop of cholent and that's going to be the tainug. It is oineg. It is a manifestation. It is an expression of Hashem's profound pleasure within His world. Let's put it slightly differently because it's a bit of a subtle concept. In the same way that on Shabbos you don't work. Why don't you work on Shabbos? There are two ways to look at it. The one way is to look at it and say, because you've got to surrender to Hashem and say, Hashem runs the world, so I'm not going to work. There's another way. The Gemara says, on Shabbos you have to look at your life, not only the day of Shabbos, you have to look at your whole life. Kilu kol melachtecha asuya. All your work is taken care of. He's got your back. You actually don't have to work. Look at the mon, which is probably the most incredible expression of Shabbos. There could not be mon food on Shabbos, because that would imply that I still need to do something to fill myself. The power of Shabbos is I don't have to do in order to have the result. So a regular Rosh Hashanah, a weekday Rosh Hashanah, we have to do in order to have the result. We have to work hard. We have to be present. We have to be willing to hand ourselves over to Hashem. A Shabbos Rosh Hashanah, we can work less. There's never a position where you don't work at all, right? But we can work less hard because the tainug is more accessible. We don't require the shofar on the first day of Shabbos. It's not that because there's some guy who might carry his shofar, we're going to cancel shofar. It's because we don't need the shofar on such a day, because the oineg of what's supposed to stimulate the creation of the world is already present. It's embedded inside Shabbos. So put Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah together, you get this chemical compound that just explodes holiness and oineg in the world in such a way that we don't have to have that profound, earth-shaking, core-wrenching shofar expression because we're already there. So therefore, if there's any concern that somebody's going to do something out of the line, we say, okay, fine, so we won't blow the shofar. Unless you're in the Beis HaMikdash. Because whatever we could experience and how high we could go in our spirituality will never measure how great the experience is in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Beis HaMikdash still has the shofar on Shabbos because the Beis HaMikdash is a platform that takes us into a realm that ordinary life couldn't take us into. So whatever heights we could achieve in any ordinary spiritual service is always more so in the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, even on Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash, they still blew the shofar to access something exponentially greater than what we have access to today. So the take home for us is, if it's a Shabbos that coincides with Rosh Hashanah as it is for us this year, that means that Hashem is already, so to speak, accommodating us and getting us to the finish line without us having to work as hard. Doesn't mean we don't work at all. If we were in the Beis HaMikdash, we would still be engaged because there'd be such a profound level to try to achieve, and therefore that gives us an insight that in the time of Mashiach, the likelihood is that we will blow the shofar again on Shabbos, because when Mashiach comes, it opens a whole range of new connections and possibilities that we never imagined. Remember, Hashem is infinite, so it's an infinite range of possibilities, and therefore we'll be challenged to work even on a Shabbos Rosh Hashanah when Mashiach comes. Okay, sorry.